Hello and welcome back to the Matthew Schoen Sociology Experience. This one being filmed once again from my panic room, as I anticipate the vast majority of the lessons in the future will be filmed right in this way. Today I want to talk about social policy. I want to pull together and tie a bow on many of the concepts, ideas, and theories we've been talking about with concentrated, racialized, urban poverty. Before I get to that, a couple of announcements. I would like you to continue making progress this week on your data table. The turn-in date for that is Friday, even though there will be no lecture posted on Friday. That's just time for you to continue to work on your material. If you are being kicked off of campus, if something is happening in your life that you now have to pack up and move on very short order, I sympathize. There is nothing worse than moving. Like, it is the source of the most vicious arguments between family members. It is the source of a lot of unplanned and unanticipated bodily injuries, it seems. So if you need a little extra time, I'm happy to take that through the end of the day on Sunday. But I encourage everybody to be caught up and ready to go right on Monday morning. Okay. One final announcement. If there's anything positive that's going on right now, if there's anything really good and uplifting during this really difficult time frame that we're in, it might just be that the census is still going on. Look at that. I got my invitation to complete the census just a couple days ago. And when I opened this mail and I saw that I was going to be counted in the most heroic demographic undertaking in the country's history, I collapsed on my porch and started weeping tears of joy. I didn't actually cry on my porch, but it certainly felt that way. It was a very uplifting thing. So I'll be completing the census this week, and I encourage you to complete the census as well if you are still getting mail, which I certainly hope that you are. Okay, let's get to today's material. So I want to talk about social policy today, and in order to do that, I am first going to start with a review of Moving to Opportunity. I want to review the findings from Moving to Opportunity and use that to launch into a discussion of race versus social class as it pertains to the creation of social policy for the revitalization of depressed and decaying urban areas. So what did we find from Moving to Opportunity? I answered an email question just today, actually, about when these follow-ups occurred, to give you a sense, if you were a little bit confused about the time frame of Moving to Opportunity. The moving and the initial data collection occurred in the period of 1993 to 1998. Interim findings were collected in 2003. Final findings were collected in 2011, and like a final report was published in 2015. So a couple decades of data and evidence to try to understand what is happening when people move to a low poverty area. The qualitative evidence of whether people knew their neighbors and the assets that people were able to tap into or not tap into, that was all collected in 2010. So a pretty significant period of time after the original move occurred. So if you were a low-income household and you were fortunate enough to receive one of these vouchers that allowed you to move to a low-poverty area, you did get increased access to housing, and you got improved housing. Not really a surprise there. You had an increased level of safety. You had a safer neighborhood. You were less likely to be a victim of a crime. You were less likely to be psychologically distressed. If you were an adult, your depression levels, your chances of being depressed generally declined. And you also had a lower rate of obesity over time. So some interesting effects there. It was, in terms of education and behavior, fantastic for teenage girls. It probably screwed up teenage boys pretty significantly. It seems that they came out a bit worse off than even teenage boys that stayed in those high poverty neighborhoods, right? So networks of mobility versus networks of survival, there appears to be a gender variable that helps you explain what type of network you create and what type of network you're able to take advantage of. It ultimately had absolutely no effect on people's employment or income. It had no real effect on achievement or schooling, although if you only look at girls, which I think is stupid to just only look at one gender, then there probably was a positive effect there. But the strongest effect was people who moved in childhood, perhaps because children's networks are not as well formed in that stage. If you're 7 years old, you have a friend group, I'm sure, but you're not as connected to what's happening in your neighborhood, and you haven't had that friend group and those friend relationships for nearly as long as teenagers ultimately have. So we see a very strong effect if you moved in childhood. And those of you that emailed me about your thoughts on moving to opportunity and whether it worked or not, a lot of you did mention this, that the fact that children were certainly thriving more so than people who stayed in high poverty areas, low income areas. That's not nothing. That's absolutely something that's worth highlighting as a very positive and beneficial outcome of this particular study. Now, my opinion, I'll give you my opinion here. I admit that I'm split and honestly kind of shrugging my shoulders as to whether moving to opportunity, quote unquote, worked. Here's my larger, if I were to take away my urbanist cap and put on instead just my scholarly cap, it seems to me that the MTO experiment was methodologically brilliant. It was perfectly set up. It was incredibly well executed. It had beautiful response rates, and it had absolutely brilliant follow-up rates. So the people who designed this just passed my research methodology class. Actually, they should be teaching my research methodology class. It was methodologically brilliant, but it was probably a bit politically and socially naive. Here's what I mean by that. It was probably naive to assume that changing the environment changes everything about your life, as if everything that happened to you up to that point is going to just be magically erased. There are lifelong consequences towards how you grow up, how you spend your adolescence, and how you spend your young adulthood, even if that changes. So to give you a few other examples, especially international, examples, other ways that this has been studied, the lifelong effect of being in a stressful situation. There's been a lot of follow-up psychological research on the residents of places like Sarajevo. Sarajevo is the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which from 1991 through 95 was under just a horrific siege during the Yugoslav Civil War by the Bosnian Serb army. The generation that came of age and lived through the siege in Sarajevo has never really come off the elevated levels of stress and trauma that occurred by living in a city that was surrounded by a hostile army. And I don't know what kind of a neighborhood you grew up in, but I can tell you certainly the neighborhood I grew up in, I didn't have to worry. If I was walking to the grocery store, I didn't have to worry about a foreign army sniper shooting me in the middle of the street. And that has some lifelong effects on people. Like, that generation has never really come back down from the elevation. Okay. And we've seen this in psychological research as well about the effect of chronic stress on individuals' lives. Stress is a good thing if it's temporary. Stress allows you to work harder than you thought you were capable of. Stress allows you, in some cases, perhaps to run faster than you ever thought you could. So that's why stress is an evolutionary advantage for individuals. Think about if you go camping in the Upper Peninsula and you see a bear, that's a stressful situation. And experiencing that stress floods your body with cortisol, which creates a very elevated adrenaline response that allows you to do things your body wouldn't normally be capable of. What if it's not seeing a bear in the Upper Peninsula, though? What if it's that my dad is coming home from the bar every single night in very unpredictable moods? I want to be clear, that's not a personal story. That's certainly not a personal story. But think of it that way. The effect of that type of chronic stress of an abnormal environment on individuals, it's probably lifelong. And what many public health researchers have shown is that the effect of chronic stress is such that the on-off switch of your cortisol and your adrenaline levels, it kind of gets flipped to permanently on. And that has a lot of consequences for your ability to plan long-term and your ability to take steps to improve your life. And it has health consequences too. It leads to all sorts of problems with, it leads to a narrowing and a hardening of your arteries that creates a lot of heart problems. Perhaps not coincidentally, this is why heart disease is one of the #1 killers of men who are very prone to stress, and also particularly bad at dealing with that stress. And also why heart disease is very overrepresented within low-income communities. It's stressful to be poor, and it sucks to be poor. So even though changing environments can solve my immediate problems about whether there are drugs being sold in my neighborhood or whether or not there's a high homicide rate, this network erosion and the elevated stress from now being in a new uncomfortable situation probably erodes whatever gains were being given through that early stage of moving to opportunity. Okay, so that's why I say it's politically naive. It's methodologically brilliant to organize this study so we can understand what the effect of a move is, independent of human capital characteristics, but it's a bit socially naive to think that a new neighborhood you've been in for, say, even 5 years is somehow going to outweigh the other 40 years of your life, just to use a randomly chosen age there, for example. Okay, so social policy then now needs to go a little bit beyond just saying, if you live in a bad area, let's move you to a good area. Do you live in some of those communities in Los Angeles described in the film? Let's move you to Anaheim, or let's move you to Bel Air. What moving to opportunity did not do, and this is not a criticism of the people who put it together, because moving to opportunity could not do this. It did not and could not address what caused concentrated poverty, ghettoized poverty, and racialized poverty in the first place. Okay. And this is where social policy becomes very important, but it also starts to get bogged down in some non-productive discussions, in my opinion. At least, like, I realize there's a lot of really interesting policy being done in many areas, but when it comes to the level of a whole city, we often see the policy discussion fall into one of two camps. And I should clarify, this is exactly the type of thing that Wilson is responding to when he writes the type of stuff that he writes. The first is that it's all about class. Think about your kind of classic Bernie Sanders type of policy. It's all about economic inequality. It's all about the growing divides within the class. It's all about the creation now of a social safety net going forward that solves the needs and fulfills the basic functions of a local government. So it's all about class. And then you will get a second kind of camp that says, no, it's all about race, because class doesn't matter when race is one of the primary determinants of how people are going to be doing in their lives. When we can see racialized patterns in wealth accumulation, in rates of home ownership, in rates of higher education attainment, we see a very racialized pattern there, independent of what's going on at the class level. What Wilson would say about this, the punchline from the stuff I've assigned from Wilson, and I've actually been very happy to see you guys engaging with these concepts and these ideas within the reaction papers that you've been writing for me. The punchline here is both of those things. It's both race and it's class. And not surprisingly, what Wilson has written, like two of his other books, which, if this is a topic that continues to be of interest of you, I suggest going to your library, or I guess probably not going to it now, but maybe ebooks, I guess, for the foreseeable future, and reading the book that Wilson wrote just before this and just after When Work Disappears. The first one was called The Declining Significance of Race. And what Wilson was trying to do there is understand how Black living standards had changed and why they had changed in the post-civil rights era. It's a very, very interesting sociological text on the intersection between race and class. And the book he wrote right after When Work Disappears is called More Than Just Race, which, again, he's really trying to unify these two things. In order to understand the well-being of the African-American population, you have to take labor markets and social class into account, and vice versa. To understand social class in the country, you got to understand the state of racial inequality and how that can be maybe alleviated going forward. So the punchline here is both of those things, is both of these things that need to be addressed. And therein lies the problem of concentrated poverty. If you've taken likely any sociology class that dealt with American and United States issues, It's very easy, I think, for people to grasp and understand how racial disadvantage, both contemporary racial disadvantage and historical discrimination and oppression that then creates divergent opportunity structures going forward into the future. It's very easy to grasp how that is exacerbating class-based inequalities. If you don't have access to opportunity structures, social class inequality is going to become much more polarized. But once you start to racialize something in its framing, now the whole thing gets incredibly complicated. And I would argue it shouldn't be all that complicated to conceptualize race and class as interrelated concepts and identities. But once something gets racialized in its framing, it becomes a political hand grenade. It becomes something that gets tossed around. And even if it's not explicitly racialized, our minds are very good at implicitly doing this, even if we don't know that we're doing it. And even though often we are aware of what these implicit things are. So take something like affirmative action. If I just look at this, here is a policy. Now, look, I understand that various states, various countries have different things that actually happen under the policy of affirmative action. So it's very difficult to do a global worldly description of what affirmative action means. But let's just read the question here. I will move my face. Hi, now I'm in the middle. In general, do you think affirmative action programs designed to increase the number of Black and minority students on college campuses are a good thing or a bad thing? So let's look at the total. 63% of Americans surveyed here, and this is from 2014, say that's a good thing. 30% say that is a bad thing, and 8% say they don't know. Okay, fair enough. I can see that there's almost twice as much support for this on the good thing than on the good side than on the bad side. But let's look at the breakdown of this. I can see that there's far less support for these types of things among white respondents than you see among Black and Hispanic respondents, and especially strong objection to this on the Republican side of things, with independents also, quite interestingly, independents, which might be libertarians, I don't know, being twice as likely to say this is a bad thing than Democrats. Okay, this is not a political discussion, nor is a discussion of racialized attitudes towards social policy, but I'm saying just by framing this in racial terms, this generates a backlash. This generates a backlash, and it ends up coloring the entire idea of affirmative action through racial terms. There is research from a sociologist at UCLA named Kimberly Crenshaw, whose work I very much admire, where she's shown through a lot of qualitative work on college campuses that one of the side effects of affirmative action is even if a student, really anybody of color, is enrolled in that college and their entrance had nothing to do with affirmative action, just knowing that affirmative action is a thing often leads to a very detrimental type of stereotype where you're assumed that, oh, well, you got here through affirmative action, because it's not like I can see your high school transcript. It's not like I know what your GPA is. So we go off the only thing that we know, which is that A, affirmative action is a thing, and B, there are students of color on my campus, right? This one and many other. So Crenshaw's work, I very much buy it about how a stigma can develop as a result of it. And it's very hard to social policy your way out of that. Furthermore, race ethnicity is one and only one element that's afforded consideration in the case of something like college admission. So this can go, in some cases, this works in employment as well, and in many other areas. But let's just stick with college, because that's easily the most talked about and the most well-known social affirmative action program. That is not, strictly speaking, a racial program. What affirmative action says for colleges is that you can take steps as a college, as an institution, to consider various statuses in the decisions that you make for shaping the kind of entry class that you want to have. Race and ethnicity is one element that's afforded consideration. So I see this political cartoon. I really enjoy this. Daughter of alum, a son of big donor, soccer player, raised in distant state, minority. Who is being pointed at as the face of affirmative action, and that is by no means fair. But it's kind of funny if I think about this at take a school I went to, take Ohio State. Affirmative action also allows the admission decisions to look at things like what the athletic teams are going to look like. So if Coach Ryan Day says, this is the quarterback that I want, guess who's getting into Ohio State University? That guy is absolutely getting in. But we don't think of that as affirmative action. It's funny, anybody in Ohio that's very opposed to affirmative action, I never hear them talk about whether the football players, got in through affirmative action, even though like the creation of a football roster does qualify as a type of affirmative action. If the marching band here at Albion needs a French horn player or a trumpet player, and there's only one that applied, guess who's getting into the college, right? Something like coming from a far off country or a far off state, in the interest of adding geographic diversity. That stuff happens all the time. So race is one element, but it's easily the most controversial. It's easily the thing that everybody points to, even though people don't understand it all that well. Now, I admit, I work at a college. I have spent many, many years of my life in the sphere of influence of a college, either going to one or being employed by one. I've never gotten to sit in on a meeting where the discussion between admissions counselors was being had. But these discussions happen all the time about what the needs of the campus are. And it's funny to me, and perhaps a little heartbreaking, how deeply racialized this has become when that's one and only one thing that's actually considered in the process here. So that's just one example of a race-based policy inflaming these biases. Now, on the other side, class-based policies have the advantage of tapping into things like the American labor movement, our union history, the era of industrialism, which we very much romanticize in this country, and probably not in a very positive way. These class-based policies about the working class and solidarity and labor power, that may not inflame the implicit bias in a way that affirmative action does. But there's a very clear problem here. They're filtered through pre-existing institutions, which are themselves byproducts of a discriminatory national history. And we are by no means the only country that has this issue, but this is the one we're trying to make social policy for, right? Not for the Dutch or the Germans or the British or anybody else, okay? This is, in my mind, part of why Andrew Yang, who just kind of came out of nowhere and had a campaign that felt extremely fresh, his idea of the universal basic income, or what he liked to call the freedom dividend, just felt very fresh. And I think it's because I think the thing that a lot of people were drawn to, well, there's two things. I will say that even though I probably would not have voted for Andrew Yang if he was still on the ballot when it came time to vote in the Michigan primaries, I found Andrew Yang to be just so aggressively likable. He just seemed like a really likable fellow and a guy I wanted to have a beer with. But at the same time, the bigger issue that I think was happening here is he had a campaign that seemed to transcend race and class, okay? It was the idea of just everybody gets a universal basic income, regardless of your racial ethnic background, regardless of your social class, right? I'm going to get the same check sent to me as Bill Gates gets. I am going to get the same check sent to me as you get sent under something like the universal basic income. Now, is the UBI a good or a bad thing? That's a discussion for an entirely different day. I kind of suspect that some element of it is a good thing, and perhaps that gets normalized once we all get our Trump dividends, and if and when that ever happens. But the bigger point here is that that's something that, regardless of your class positioning, regardless of your racial and ethnic background, that's something that can transcend those things. And there are very few policies that can transcend those pre-existing institutional histories that are embedded into our social structures. So here's an example. Student loan forgiveness is something that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and other politicians have spoken about for a while. Now, to the many, 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 many people who currently hold student loan debt, that's attractive. I assume that seems attractive. But we know that Black college attendance and Black college completion is much more limited than it is for whites and also for white Hispanics, right? For non-white Hispanics, it's somewhere in between. So I look at it that way, and it's like, all right, addressing college sounds great, but how about making sure that there isn't a disproportional dropout rate in high school for racial or ethnic minorities? That's an example of a class-based policy kind of being filtered through pre-existing institutions to create even more racial disadvantage going forward. Because if a whole bunch of white students get their student loans forgiven, well, I'm happy for them. That's great for the people who got their loans forgiven. But for anybody who experienced a failed educational system in a place like Detroit, that is not something that's going to push them forward, right? To have their college loan forgiveness, college loans forgiven, because the damage has already been done. So class-based policies often don't address the racial disadvantage, and racial policies often inflame a whole bunch of tensions unfairly, but that's also just reality. That's kind of how it goes. So that's the problem between race and class. Wilson wants you to see these things as intertwined, and doing so would perhaps allow a more complete type of policy prescription. And a more complete policy prescription is absolutely what is necessary, because poverty is a multi-institutional problem. How do I want to put this? When I look at elements of the social safety net and elements of social welfare in the United States, the big problem that I see is that current policy tends to focus on alleviating the conditions of poverty. It seems targeted at eliminating human suffering. If you are a poor single mother, something like WIC, Women and Infant Children, will allow you to provide the basic necessities for your infant child. If you are living under the poverty line, and you make no money, and you're unemployed and have less than a high school education, you just cannot make the money that you need in order to support yourself or anybody else that might depend on you, TANF, Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, will give you at least some amount of money for the basics that you need to stay out of poverty. Or not to stay out of poverty, but the very basics of shelter, a little bit of food, whatever. That's alleviating human suffering. And perhaps that's as good a reason as any to continue with the social safety net. Human suffering is bad. Yeah, that's my professional opinion. It just sounded so amateur. Like human suffering is bad. No, poverty is a degrading social condition. Poverty is a disgusting situation to be living in. And in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, which people often say that America is the wealthiest country in the world, that's not actually true. Norway is, but in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, our level of absolute and relative poverty rates are, in my opinion, unacceptable. And there's no reason why it has to continue that way. But the social safety net tends to focus on just alleviating the consequences of poverty. Like, I can't afford food, I can't afford rent, I can't afford basic necessities, rather than investing in people's capacity to be flourishing members of this society. So if I consider the institutions that we've spent some time on, like I have spent weeks now trying to demonstrate to you that ghettoized poverty is a complicated thing. I personally feel that I have made that case rather successfully. And we have looked at institutions such as labor markets and the skills mismatch that can develop there. We have looked at housing markets and the segregation and how segregation produces a spatially mismatched metropolitan area. We have touched a little bit on the education system as it relates to skills mismatch theory. So that's a separate institution that plays into it. Like the labor market, societal change is not such a bad thing if the opportunity structure remains accessible along with it, but the education system is not particularly equipped to do that. And we've spent a little time on the political system about the local decisions that power brokers make. If you think all the way back to the city as a growth machine, and who has the ability to make decisions, and what types of things do they value in terms of growth and profit and social economic investments going forward. So if I create a welfare system that addresses one of these institutions and leaves the other ignored, I am simply not going to dent the problem. I might be able to alleviate the conditions of poverty, but I probably am not going to fix the problem of concentrated, racialized, ghettoized poverty in the United States. And until such time, there's not a lot to discuss, okay? But in the interest of trying to push that discussion forward, what Wilson's bias is, and this is why Wilson is universally regarded as a brilliant and incredibly influential social scientist. And also, if you take a look at that picture of Wilson, that's a very recent picture of William Julius Wilson. He is 79 years old. He doesn't look it to me there. It's a guy who's aging gracefully, let's say. And 79 years old, he still works a full schedule at his university home of Harvard University. He looks to me like he's about 65 in that picture. Anyway, he argues in his books. Let me go backwards. I'm sorry. My point is saying he's universally regarded as a brilliant, influential social scientist, but because he tries to bridge the gap between structure and culture, race and social class, people who care the most about class always say he's not paying enough attention to it. And people who pay the most attention, who really care the most about race, always say he's not paying enough attention to that. And I find those criticisms of him to be myopic, in my opinion. I think that he's one of the only scholars that's trying to come up with multi-institutional explanations and multi-institutional solutions to very complicated urban and national and really global social problems, which is a hell of a lot more than I can say from my own research, where I just sit around trying to come up with something new to say about European protest raids. So Wilson argues, and I realize this is going to take a bit of mental gymnastics, but I hope you can see his point here. Wilson argues that the best way to pursue urban revitalization, you have to come to grips with two slightly ironic realities. The first is to realize that if you care about urban poverty, it's not really about cities. And the second, if you really care about racial equality, it's not really about minorities. And that is, like, on the face of it, a bit of an unsatisfying way to talk about racialized urban poverty. But if you break down what he's saying there, right, go back and look at the reading that's assigned for today and really dive into it. Wilson's point is that cities, due to their historical nature, it's not that cities are the only places where poverty is occurring, but cities are the places where it has become the most acute, okay, and the most noticeable. So if you want to address urban poverty, you have to think about what the causes of economic failure or success are in the United States. And to understand racial disadvantage, it's not really about the experience of minorities themselves and what they're doing in their day-to-day life. It's about understanding their ability to access opportunity structures. And that seems like, to me, that if it sounds unsatisfying to think of it that way, but it might actually come the closest to really describing the way to create real change within local urban communities. Okay, so it's not about cities, it's not about minorities, it is about how the opportunity structure of post-industrial capitalism has eroded certain urban neighborhoods and degraded the living standards of minorities who, through discriminatory institutions, are blocked from being able to fully access those new opportunities. So Wilson's argument here is very much in favor of class-based policies. May I just say, as an aside, it is so unsatisfying personally for me to try to give a passionate lecture and to get very worked up while sitting in my empty panic room. And I can actually hear my bird. Maybe he'll make an appearance in the next video. I can hear my bird singing out there. So that is my alarm that I need to keep moving and get back out to my dependent child out there. Wilson's argument here, for this reason, because he's arguing it's not really about cities and it's not really about minorities, it's about post-industrial capitalism, his argument is very much in favor of class-based policies. I suspect his background has something to do with this. William Julius Wilson was born in 1935 in Western Pennsylvania. So he was born into the era when during the Great Migration, right? Like during large chunks of the Great Migration, when African-American households were migrating north and accessing the increased opportunities that an industry gave them. So he grew up in an era of increased Black living standards. And he recognized how industry gave formerly poor Blacks those opportunities. I suspect one of the things, and he's alluded to this in some of his writings as well, I suspect one of the major things he's conceptualizing here is industry gave his people opportunities. How can we make sure post-industry also gives minorities those same opportunities? He saw how social class kind of uplifted the Black population during this time frame, and I suspect that's why it's part of the reason he focuses on class-based policies. But at the same time, he does have a point here, and so I very much leave it up to you to decide how you feel about this. Class-based attention would definitely, like if we passed a bunch of social policies that were really targeted at social class, at the poor, the working class, and the middle class, that would have the backdoor effect of addressing social class and economic inequality. Which, a slight aside on this, I'm filming this right on the day that Congress and the Senate are squabbling over this economic stimulus bill that's coming. We are seeing this, like the needs of people who are getting laid off right now as this virus rips through our society. The needs are not the same as the needs of American Airlines or the needs of all these companies. I find it very interesting and borderline tragic that people like you and me are expected to have thousands and thousands of dollars saved up so we can start paying our bills if something bad happens. But the United Airlines CEO is threatening massive job layoffs if they don't get significant government support by the end of March. Why is it that the corporation gets to spend all their money on fucking stock buybacks, which are such an artificial way of increasing the value of the company without even creating any type of innovation or worker benefits, while the rest of us are expected to plan for the future. Anyway, point of the story is that would start by addressing inequality. It would start by addressing the growth of the 0.1%, the 1%, the top 10%, whatever group you want to target here. What Wilson argues, and I very much think he has a strong point on this, that would disproportionately help urban areas where you have large pockets of working class and poor individuals that can be reached fairly easily. And it would disproportionately help racial minorities. If you look at the Black poverty rate compared to the white poverty rate, if you look at the Black jobless rate compared to the white jobless rate, it's easy to see how even just a class-based attention could disproportionately benefit racial minorities going forward. And Wilson has argued it would avoid a lot of these class-based, or That's a mistake. I'm sorry. That should say race-based antagonisms. Maybe. Right. It's because, and I say that because even if something isn't explicitly racial, it can become racialized. Here's actually another example of this. If I go back to my affirmative action thing, that's easily seen as a racial policy. But as I said, it is far more encompassing than that. And back at Ohio State, one of the things that I knew, but I don't think a lot of other people knew it very well, was that the number one group that benefited the most from affirmative action in Ohio State's admissions decisions was students from Appalachia, where you have very, very rural, poor, white populations. I will not argue that growing up in a poor community in rural southwestern Ohio is, I would never argue that growing up in that type of a community is unworthy of affirmative action. Affirmative action is meant to uplift people, and the poor whites of Southwest Ohio very much need uplifting as well. But it's funny to me, and again, slightly tragic, how that never gets discussed. But the Black students from inner city Cleveland get singled out if they happen to get into Ohio State. Just an aside on that. So anyway, I leave it up to you to decide whether this is naive or wise. Wilson thinks that by focusing on class, you can uplift African Americans living in poverty or in the working class without inflaming racial tensions and implicit bias. That's always been his argument. You may think that that's naive. You may think that that's wise. I ultimately leave it up to you to determine that. And once again, just like we did last time, I will say when you finish watching this film, email me just a very short paragraph statement about whether you think class-based policy or race-based policy is a more effective way to pursue a more equitable social opportunity structure and try to address this issue of concentrated urban racialized poverty. But what would any of this look like in practice? That's kind of one of the million dollar question here, because if we say we want class-based policy that is also going to disproportionately help the people who need it the most, what would any of this look like in practice? Well, we do have some examples of this happening at the metropolitan area and paying some dividends. So I would think something like jobs. That has always been Wilson's biggest concern. Has been very worried throughout his life about the transition from segregated ghettos to jobless and institutional ghettos. Job creation, job expansion, and job training connect people better to labor market opportunities. The Minneapolis-St. Paul region has probably done more work on this than anybody else in terms of what their public works program looks like and what their what the expansion of the job opportunities, especially at the level of the municipality, looks like. So Minneapolis-St. Paul, they're not really waiting around for companies to move there. Their government is creating, locally that is, creating jobs themselves, which is a very interesting, way to look at it. We're so used to thinking of the private sector as job creators, which, in a bear market might be how they deserve to be viewed. But the public sector very much has a role to play here. And again, if you believe that cities are more than just the sum of their real estate deals, then there's a role for the public sector to play here. Something like public education investments. If you just go and Google best school districts in the country, you will scroll through dozens and dozens of suburban school districts before you reach your first urban school district. But I am aware that the public schools of San Diego have been very well funded. They put a lot of money into it. They spend a lot of money per capita per pupil. They do a lot of really interesting things with pedagogical methods and with teacher training and teacher service. They pay high salaries for their public school teachers, and not surprisingly, it's a pretty good job to work in San Diego, and it's also my favorite city in the entire country. So even if it was not not compensated well, you still live in San Diego, which is not a bad place to be. You can think about investments in early childhood programs. So New York City comes to mind here in terms of their subsidized childcare for working parents and their investments in universal preschool in order to give students a bit of a leg up. I always argue that education is not as meaningful as we think it is, but if we can have early childhood interventions that stop inequalities from developing, that's probably a good thing in the long run. Right? That probably puts people better positioned to take advantage of elementary school and high school and college, hopefully, if they ultimately get there. So people always say, who's going to pay for it? Who's going to pay? All these cities have figured it out. Right? All these cities have figured it out in a way. Transportation, spatial mismatch theory is something I am a massive believer in. Washington, D.C. has sewed together a very, very functional public transportation system. And as a result has it connects the neighborhoods within the urban core. It connects the city to the suburbs. You don't need a car and probably are not well served by having a car if you live in a place like Washington. And so if you live in one of these kind of segregated communities in DC, on the west side of DC, and you found a retail job in Northern Virginia, you can take pretty functional public transportation to that. So it's not eliminated, but it has alleviated a bit of the spatial mismatch that is endemic to so many urban areas. Metro area cooperation. I talked about this with the move to a county level government, about how when we did Cleveland, about sprawl without growth, if Cleveland went essentially to a county level, if Cuyahoga County became the city of Cleveland, it instantly goes from the 52nd largest city in the country to the 10th largest city in the country. So you can make it a major market almost overnight. Granted, if everybody else does that, then it just kind of slips right down the order. But for right now, it's something that Indianapolis has done stunningly well. And they have consistently voted to reapprove the county level government, where they share resources, they eliminate redundancies at the public sector, they save money. And so certain areas that are spending a lot of money on these types of fire, police, or public service redundancies can probably save a lot of money that can be put into other things and reinvested in social programs through this type of metro area county-wide governments, a la what Louisville, Indianapolis, and Nashville have done, and what I suspect St. Louis will be doing again in the future. And then finally, the biggest thing we could do, and probably the least likely to actually happen, is to just think about what our neighbors across the Atlantic are doing. What about our friends in Europe? And so I will toot my own horn here a little bit. If you're very curious about what European society does perhaps better and perhaps worse than us, I do teach a class. I'll be teaching a class next year called European Integration. Which will be really a very interesting, I think, overview of European politics and society. One of the things I always hear, because Bernie Sanders loves talking about the Scandinavian-style social safety net, one of the things I always hear in terms of objections to that is, Europeans are getting all this stuff for free. Well, that's absolutely not true. Europeans are not getting shit for free. And I often hear that, what's going on with the taxes here? The tax burden is high. Yes, but that's a trade-off here. So if I look at a country like Germany, they have moderately higher taxes than we do in the United States. But think about what you're getting for that. In a country like Germany, you don't pay for college, you don't pay for education, you don't pay for healthcare, you don't pay for rent if you're in public housing, which a stunning number of Europeans actually are, and not in a bad way. Public housing in urban areas does not nearly have the same negative connotation that it does in the United States. Where is that coming from? The Germans are paying into those systems over the life course, and as a result, it is there for you when you need it. So we are paying huge sums of money for medical treatment, whereas the Germans are paying small amounts every month into these systems, and then it's there for them when they need it. It's a type of social insurance that the European safety net is really well designed to provide. Things like housing, healthcare, pensions and retirement, and public safety. And so the big thing I want you to think about is, do you want to be Do you want to make a lot of money and be responsible for spending a lot of money, or would you be willing to pay more into a very functional tax system that would then provide these things for you if and when you need them? One of the interesting things about Europe is, despite the fact that their economies are generally worse performing, they're a little more efficient with many of the tasks that they need to be accomplishing socially, even if Italy does not look it right now. The European safety net, we probably don't want to become Europe, but it would behoove us to think about what elements of European society might serve us well if we could implement them in our own society. So, in terms of what we shouldn't do, well, first of all, let's not pretend that this problem is going to magically fix itself. That's not going to happen, because cities can revive on their own. So if I think about, like, San Francisco always used to be known as kind of a gritty working class place. It had a real dock and port culture. The fishermen, these kind of tough men that spent all day on boats out in the Bay Area harbor. San Francisco was known as kind of a gritty place, and it has now become one of the wealthiest cities in the country. But because that just sort of happened on its own through the placement of the tech industry in Silicon Valley, because there was no advanced planning for that, it ended up worsening pre-existing inequality. Certain areas got heavily gentrified, and certain areas got completely disinvested from. And it's created, San Francisco has the biggest affordable housing crisis in the country. San Francisco has the biggest homeless population per capita in the country. Also, really high rates of drug addiction in in places like the Tenderloin District, for example. I also encourage you, don't think of cities like they're just laboratories to experiment in. Oh, hey, well, what if you just took away this community center and moved it here? What happens there? Cities, these are people's lives that we're talking about. And these are people who are trying to get by, and they deserve respect, not just from local governments, but from the people that study them. So those of you that are really interested in social policy, don't look at a community as something that you need to go in and fix, even if that is a community that has problems that need people's energy and investment to fix. Don't look at it like a laboratory. Look at it like a social situation that can be organized in a way that better and more equitably serves the needs of the people that are living within it. Bottom line, it will take a multi-institutional approach to ensure that we get full social participation in the country. It's a multi-institutional problem, and it is going to take a multi-institutional society. And this is why I remember saying on the very first day of class, this is an urban sociology class, but there is no such thing as urban sociology, because all sociology and all social analysis is the analysis of the city. Thank you very much. I'll see you on Monday. Be well.